And as many of you guys know, this is part of our community education series. We're actually right in the process right now with our community education committee, which is a volunteer committee, part of the land stewards program. We're in the process of scheduling for more of these events going forward. So if there's a topic that's on your mind, you think is particularly, interesting and you want to bring forward, or a great speaker that you'd like to invite to come and talk to our community about subjects related to stewardship, reach out to me, send me an email. Let's connect and sooner than later, so that we have the information and we can work towards making it happen. Speaking of events that are coming up, this talk tonight is actually paired with a field visit to the Pacific Forest Trust property up off the Mount Ashland Road here, to see in person and experience some of the things that Lyndia is going to present about tonight and the work they're doing. That'll be on Saturday, and you can still register for that. Coming up November 15th, there's a pile burning workshop in Williams. There's been a couple of these good information to learn, gain, especially if you burn piles. We've all had close calls and lit them off at the wrong time. So it happens to everyone. It's good to learn. Even if you burned before, go to one of these workshops. We also have a Zoom presentation coming up, prescribed burning for private land stewards. That's Chris Adlam with Extension, and there'll be Aaron Krikabaugh with the Rogue Valley Prescribed Burn Association. That'll be online, also recorded. Good information. And then we have Paul DiMaggio with Soil and Water. He's going to be talking about understanding the water systems for the Rogue Valley, and that's December 9th. We've got more stuff coming after that, so stay tuned. You can always find our schedule of events if you visit the Land Stewards page on the web. And if you're here to learn about forest restoration and management for climate resilience and wildlife, you're in the right spot. I'm really pleased to have Lyndia Hammer with us tonight. Lyndia serves as Pacific Forest Trust Stewardship and Outreach Associate. She's fascinated by forest disturbance ecology, passionate about the improvement of forest management to benefit all beings, and delighted to share nature observations with people of all ages. Lyndia came to PFT from a background in forestry, wildlife, and restoration, and holds a BS in biology from Southern Oregon University, SOU, and an MS in forestry from the University of Missouri Center for Tree Ring Science. Lyndia and I've known each other for quite a while, and I've always been really impressed by her work and her dedication. She really helped improve the treatments on post-fire fuels and the riparian area down along Bear Creek, and volunteered quite a bit of her time to help us figure out how to best retain snags and make that project as beneficial in the long run for wildlife as possible. And she volunteered a lot of that time, and I know that's just demonstrates your dedication to this kind of work, Lyndia. So thanks for joining us tonight. I'm going to stop my screen share and hand it over to you.
Thanks, Eugene. Let me do the screen share here.
I also
Can you
think
see it?
We can see it.
I'll go into presentation mode here.
Great. And I'll also just say, one last thing about Lyndia, her experience. She worked at Southern Oregon Land Conservancy for a while, and she got to visit a lot of properties there and forests in all different sorts of states, and be involved in lots of conservation projects. So she's coming with a really strong background that I'm sure has set you up well for this Pacific Forest Trust work.
Thanks, Eugene. Yeah, I appreciate that. Appreciate the intro. Appreciate the land acknowledgement, and coming to join the land stewards tonight. When I was working for Southern Oregon Land Conservancy for about 5 years before my last year here at Pacific Forest Trust, my title was land steward. So I like coming to the land steward presentation. My current title is Stewardship and Outreach Associate. I'm doing some outreach and education in addition to stewardship at our Mount Ashland Demonstration Forest. My coworker, Jack Singer, his name is on this title slide here. He will be with us on Saturday. For those of you that can come to our field tour, he's had to be up in Portland for today, so he couldn't make this. But He's been with PFT for around 5 years, and so he's had a lot to do with putting together the management plan that I'll tell you more about here. Before I move on, I just wanted to say that, like Eugene mentioned, I've got some background in wildlife, and that's where I started, was just simple observation of wildlife, like someone might do in their backyard or in a park. And worked as a field biologist, and then slowly over time, I got interested in what's happening at these different stages of forest development and what's going on with these disturbances like fire and floods and drought and all that sort of stuff. So that's been my journey, a lot of it in the Klamath-Siskiyou ecoregion. So today we'll get into just who is Pacific Forest Trust, and what are we doing, what are the tools we use to do forest conservation, what about this Mount Ashland Demonstration Forest, what are our goals for this climate resilient management, how are we trying to address these sort of multiple objectives of sustainable forestry, protecting wildlife, protecting water, and so on. And oh yeah, I wanted to say, please ask questions throughout. I'm not a professor. I'm more of a field ecologist, land manager. So I know you all are probably eating dinner and doing things, but feel free to raise your hand or put your question in the chat, or I'm happy if you interrupt and ask me a question. I don't know how the meeting, you might not be able to, but get your questions to the moderators so they can let you off of mute, and I'd be happy to take a break in here. I've got, I don't know, around 40 or 45 slides or something, so happy to pause throughout. So Pacific Forest Trust, our mission, we're a nonprofit. We've been a nonprofit for about 30 years. And our mission is really about wood, water, wildlife, and community well-being. And we do this through partnering with private landowners, developing economic incentives to reward good management that actually can provide for clean water and wildlife habitat while harvesting some trees. So the way to do that is through conservation of private forests, restoration, or enhancement of private forests, and we advocate for policies and incentives. We do have some great minds working on policy work in Sacramento and nationally. So we're going to talk mostly about restoring or enhancing private forests today. And the main tool we use is a working forest conservation easement. Coalition of Oregon Land Trust defines that as a negotiated agreement between a landowner and a land trust to protect private land. It's generally open space, provides habitat, may be protected specifically for education or recreation. Why do we do this and how do we do it? First of all, it can be with a variety of private landowners. It can be small private woodland owners, family forest landowners. It could be timber management organizations or commercial timber owners. But landowners have their own relationship with the land. Often, forest landowners have some financial interest. Within the conservation easement, there can be designations of special habitat management zones, performance targets, and harvest restrictions that ensure some level of sustainable harvest while protecting key attributes and habitat features. And then there is often a financial compensation that can come as a direct payment or some tax benefits. Typically, landowners are giving up development rights. They might be giving up subdivision rights. They might be giving up some of their timber value. And so that will lower the appraised value of the property and in turn result in lower market value, reduced taxation, or in some cases an actual payment. So Pacific Forest Trust has conserved over 100,000 acres using this working forest conservation easement. The power of the conservation easement is it's permanent. It's a deed that runs with the land, even if the land changes ownership. And as such, it's a responsibility for the land trust is then responsible to monitor and enforce the terms of that easement in perpetuity. PFT also does some fee title acquisitions. There have been, you'll see a map coming up here that'll show a bunch of inholdings. There were some private industrial forest land inholdings surrounded by the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument, surrounded by public ownership. PFT purchased those, held them, and transferred them to the monument. So there have been some transfers like that, and then a few fee title properties. The Mount Ashland Demonstration Forest is our largest fee title property. Fee title meaning that we hold the title and own it. So the history of PFT's work here in Jackson County in the region is about a decade of doing some of that land transfer work in the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument. Then working on a conservation easement on these Mount Crest parcels. You may or may not be familiar with them. I'll show you a map here shortly so you can see where they are. They are between I-5 and the Mount Ashland and also bordering the Mount Ashland Ski Road. They encompass Slide Creek, several small drainages that drain into the Emigrant Creek, Bear Creek system. The lower part of the Mount Crest property burned during that Neal Creek wildfire this summer, just south of Ashland. Some of you might have seen it. It's a large working forest conservation easement. It was owned by it is owned by a private family, a very conservation-minded forest land owner in the region who had been doing sustainable forestry for a long time. His name is Judd Parsons. He was interested in working with Pacific Forest Trust to put his legacy sort of into a permanent conservation easement and ensuring that kind of sustainable forest management and attention to habitat features, no matter who owns that forest, that private forest land in the future. Then just in 2022 is when the Pacific Forest Trust purchased the Mount Ashland Demonstration Forest. It took a while. I have just in the parentheses here, just brief bit of its ownership. I mean, this landscape is, of course, unceded tribal lands. As Eugene mentioned in the land acknowledgement, we know the Shasta and Takelma people are indigenous to this place. During the Rogue Indian Wars, a lot of the descendants of the Shasta and Takelma were forcibly removed to the Siletz and Grand Ronde reservations. Since that time, a number of private timber companies have owned the Mount Ashland Demonstration Forest, and we were able to purchase it in 2022 and have some other working forest conservation easements in progress in the valley. So the map finally, so you can see where these are.
We have a question from David, just asking like what overall territory PFT covers. Like, is it more active in other places than here? Is there, what's the overall like range of the organization?
Yeah, it's Northern California and Oregon. Yes, a lot of the PFT's conservation projects are between San Francisco and the California border with Oregon, in the coastal redwoods, and Mendocino area. There are a number of big projects up around Mount Shasta. PFT also manages a large private forest land in the Oregon Coast Range, the Van Eck forests. It's over 7,000 acres. So a pretty long, solid history in both with Oregon and Northern California. But the Mount Ashland Demonstration Forest is relatively new for this area for us to have a fee-owned property.
Thank you.
Here in the Rogue Valley area. Yeah. And so the Mount Ashland Demonstration Forest is this purple polygon shape here that the cursor is pointing at. This big red dashed line is the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument. We've got Ashland down here in this sort of pinkish color, and Interstate 5, going south. This Mountain Crest Working Forest Conservation Easement is in blue. And then the Pacific Crest Trail going on up to Mount Ashland here somewhere. So, oh, these olive colored parcels are mostly conservation easements held by Southern Oregon Land Conservancy. I see there's some county land in this color as well, but most of these are Southern Oregon Land Conservancy conservation easements. Okay. To keep going with this, little bit more of the history of this Mount Ashland Demonstration Forest, how I came to own it, and what we're doing out there. Before the acquisition, PFT paid for its timber cruise to be completed. We got to, then we got, part of the acquisition involves having a permanent conservation easement on the property held by OWEB, Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. You may be familiar with OWEB. It's a state agency. They get funds from a tax on lottery or a fee on lottery sales in Oregon, and have a mandate to do conservation and restoration work, or pay for conservation and restoration work that protects watersheds and salmon. And they have some broader ecological goals as well. So they have a permanent conservation easement on the property, and we're able to grant some funds to help pay for some really great baseline reporting on the property. So PFT was able to hire Siskiyou Biosurvey to do some botany work, also did some wildlife surveys and songbird surveys. And then Jack, who you'll meet Saturday, he did a great job pulling together an excellent advisory committee that helped develop a management plan. So we got some good science on the property and had a lot of great conversations in the field with some experts to help develop a comprehensive and balanced management plan. And then from 2024 to the present, it was just this process of getting the plan approved by OWEB, seeking restoration funds, getting going with some monitoring, preparing for implementation. And that's where we are now. So we have a broad goal of managing for climate resilience. And some of the pieces to get there include cultivating fire-adapted forests, and patchy is my favorite word on this slide. Patchy in terms of structure, patchy in terms of species composition, some of which are particularly drought and fire resistant, some aren't. A variety, patchiness of habitat types, including wetlands, springs, meadows. We want to manage, remove when possible, manage invasive species, and we want to refrain from putting sediment into the waterways. We're up at the headwaters of Neal Creek, and past land management has definitely caused some erosion, and we want to prevent that in the future. And to show some photos of what we mean by this fire adapted forest, it's this patchy mixed-conifer hardwood stands. We've got some big leaf maple here. We've got some riparian associated shrubs, some open grown trees. We're looking for this patchiness. Here's a much younger cohort of trees, an area that was heavily logged much more recently. There's a little maple in here, but a number of very small young conifers, pine, cedar, white fir. A little bit older cohort here with a little more spacing. We're looking to retain our downed wood. We're not doing fuels reduction up here. We're between 5,000 and 6,000 feet at the north aspect at the headwaters of Neal Creek, in a forest that's been intensively logged. And so this large downed wood is very important for cultivation of soils, for habitat for fungi and insects, and small mammals, reptiles, amphibians. Similarly, we're not thinning any native shrubs, I'm happy to say. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And the part of climate resilience is patchiness, heterogeneity, variety of habitat types, openings, wet areas. A lot of young conifers on the edge of this, more open. We refer to this as a dry meadow, and this little perennial pool is back in here. I call it the bare wallow spring. But in this dry meadow, we do have a number of incense cedar stumps that have 300 plus rings on them. And so this was really probably more of a cedar savanna than a meadow historically. But again, just this diversity of habitat types is sort of showing, just wanted to include enough photos to give you a feel for what it looks like up there. This is up closer to the higher end of the property, closer to 6,000 feet. And so we're all familiar with fire being such a dominant disturbance, especially down where most of us live, closer to the valley floor. But there are a number of other important disturbances, particularly up here: snow, ice, flooding. Of course, logging is a dominant disturbance. Windstorms, fungi, insects, drought. All these disturbances create patchiness and variety in the species contribution, or species composition, excuse me. And though a few fire event cycles might have been missed up here, we haven't missed disturbance as a whole. There's been plenty of disturbance up here. This upper meadow is probably under snow about 5 months out of the year, and which likely has a hand in keeping it open. We're looking at a mountain beaver. There's a active mountain beaver tunnel in this. Can't really see it, but they make about a 8-inch diameter burrow and pull a bunch of fresh vegetation into the entrance, and that's one of the unusual species up here. So to zoom in on the 960 acre part of the ownership, it's about 4,800 feet down here. This is the lower end. This upper end is around 6,000 feet. This map just it gives you a bit of a feel for the topography and then the waterways. This map has a lot going on. It also shows invasive species occurrences mapped by Siskiyou Biosurvey. This pale peach colored circle is St. John's wort. That's what's here in this picture. We haven't come up with a plan yet for the St. John's wort. That's why I might say management of invasive species rather than eradication. It's a bit of a puzzle when you have such a widespread plant. It's mostly in these disturbed areas, landings and roads. It does provide some late season nectar and pollen for pollinators, but I wonder what else would be growing there if it wasn't a field of St. John's wort. So that's one of those head scratchers we'll have to spend some time thinking about. Luckily, we don't seem to have a lot of super noxious invasive weeds. There is a little bit of rush skeleton weed we need to watch out for, and some of the knapweeds can be pretty invasive. One of the other goals is to mitigate erosion. We've got a few culverts to keep an eye on, and a cut bank that needs a bit more stabilization. And then the other big piece with mitigating erosion is just not to follow in the footsteps of some of the past logging practices, which involved ground-based logging on slopes that were just too steep to support it. And you can get a little feel for that on these, with this sort of hillshade background where you can imagine pretty steep slopes. You don't want to, if you drive a tractor on that, you're going to be sending your soil down slope, and we're not going to do that. I like this map because it gives you a feel for the topography with this hillshade background. Again, it's really it's emphasizing mostly the aquatic type habitats, riparian and wetland type features, which are part of what make this property pretty special. On Saturday, and we'll see it in some aerial photos, but we'll take a look at this area. It's mountain alder, and which is the dominant disturbance, which keeps mountain alder as a shrub, is snow. It's snow it's just an important part of its natural history to just get smashed by snow every winter. And one pretty interesting thing about this property is that it has tailed frogs on it. Tailed frogs are only known in really not many places in Oregon, only at like higher elevation headwater streams where there's constant supply of cold water. So that's a pretty special thing about this place. Just getting into the wildlife, it is just a snapshot here of some publicly available data, and we did have some consultants doing wildlife surveys. All these, there's a ton of wildlife use out there. I have a couple cameras out in part to look for human trespass, but there's incredibly frequent use of the main road system by bears, bobcats, cougars, coyotes, foxes, jackrabbits, squirrels. It's an area rich in wildlife. One thing of interest is that the Pacific fishers do use a Snail Creek drainage. And this hillshade also gives you a bit of a feel for the Neal Creek subbasin. You can sort of see this ridge line, and the property is really situated just right up at the top of it. I threw this slide in case my bat enthusiast friend showed up. Our surveyors, our wildlife consultants did pick up a few bats using some sort of audio detectors, silver-haired bat, California myotis, and the Brazilian free-tailed bat. There are probably others. It was a fairly short duration of sampling. But my favorite species on this list, the coastal tailed frog, which I already mentioned, and then just this sort of ancient mountain beaver that again are associated with higher elevation riparian habitats, streams. A few of these slides or photos are from wildlife camera I just have up on the road, and then our consultants, Turns and environmental consultants that did the wildlife surveys, did put up a bait station to do the initial baseline surveys to find out if there were martins and fishers on the property. And so this is a Pacific fisher coming to the bait station, and they also got this photo of the cougar. And I thought I'd just pause here for a second and have a sip of water, and this kind of talk through a bunch of info at you for 25 minutes here about the property and a little bit of background. And we could maybe pause because it's fun to look at wildlife, and then when we come back, we could get into current forest conditions, a little more of the disturbance history, maybe more about the prescription and what we're hoping to do with management and challenges to implementation. And so I'm not going anywhere, but if you have any questions so far, yeah.
Lyndia, there was a question by Tom earlier, and this was before your invasive slide, but asking what do you consider to be invasive species in this forest?
Yeah. You know, I'm not an expert. I might give a different answer than someone else would, but I mean, just as a basic definition, non-native species, and then the invasive part. There are various sort of lists, which would then classify them as, invasive or just non-native but less invasive. I'm just from my sort of not super expert perspective, the ones that I think of as noxious are like star thistle and knotweed, the knapweed, the ones that spread really fast.
So not really invasive trees, but more herbaceous and potentially shrubby kind of things. Any dyer's woad? I didn't see that on your list of noted invasive.
I don't think we've detected it. And yeah, I'm not calling anything native invasive. Part of my definition of invasive has to be non-native, comes first. But yeah, not really any shrubs. We don't have any. We have pretty much all native shrubs. I don't see any dyer's woad on this list, which means it wasn't detected by our botanist.
That's great. Janine said, maybe Herb Farm would want to collect that St. John's wort.
Yeah. And the other thing that I think is interesting about in non-native species is sometimes they're there for a time period. They're doing some sort of succession. And, we see them and think, oh, we have to get rid of those. But actually, there's some succession going on. In 10 years, they're going to leave on their own. That's certainly not the case with all of them. And maybe it's longer than that. But we're not going to be totally passive with the non-native species, but we haven't really formulated a plan yet for them either.
I have a question for you from earlier in your presentation. You mentioned that OWEB was a funder of the acquisition. Does that also set you up or set Pacific Forest Trust up for acquiring more OWEB funds for restorative activities on the property? Or does it kind of prevent that for a while?
No, I think it does. It does seem to me that OWEB, once OWEB wants to fund a project, they might be interested in continuing to fund good work on that project or work that is going to progress toward the management goals for that property. So we actually have already received our first grant to do some restoration implementation, including some prescribed fire and thinning.
All right, that's great.
Yeah.
Well, we don't have anything else question-wise in the chat.
Okay. Wait, you muted yourself, or somebody muted you.
Oops, sorry. Yeah, I don't see any other questions or hands up. So if you want to move on, you can.
All right, sounds good. So here's a snapshot of the current forest condition on the property. And on the bottom, we've got tree species. White fir, Doug fir, Shasta red fir, incense cedar, ponderosa pine. I think of sugar pine being lumped in here. Big leaf maple, other hardwoods, and chinkapin. There aren't too many other hardwoods. There's some way alder, some mountain alder, very few madrone and black oak. And on this axis, percentage of total basal area. So white fir is the largest, occupies the largest percentage of basal area by far. And then within this, within this pillar of white fir are a series of diameter classes. So this orange color at the bottom, that is trees that are 0 to 5 inches in diameter. This yellow orange trees 6 to 10 inches in diameter at breast height. Breast height is 4.5 feet off the ground. This green trees 11 to 15 inches in diameter breast height. And on up, you'll see that less than 10% of the trees on the property as a whole are in this 21 to 25% or 21 to 25 inch diameter breast height. So most of the trees are fairly small. This in terms of the diameter distribution across the property, and with much dominance by white fir, Doug fir, incense cedar. Do have a good amount of chinkapin and a few others. And so, we're in the white fir zone. This is between 5,000 and 6,000 feet elevation. We're by no means trying to get rid of white fir on the property. We are concerned with in a warming climate. White fir does tend to be really susceptible to drought and beetles when it gets stressed, when it gets heat stressed, drought stressed. It's likely based on stumps and on the property, it's likely that the Doug fir, incense cedar, sugar pine were preferentially removed for value, and so as well as a lot of white fir and some Shasta red fir, but a lot of young white fir naturally regenerating following several decades of logging. So I've got a 1939 historic aerial photo here. We don't think there was much significant logging prior to this photo. You can see that Mount Ashland ski road sort of scratched in along the bottom, but not a lot of broad tail disturbance. What I see here, a lot of big trees and a lot of shadows. some more open looking areas, west facing slopes. A lot of the photos I've been showing you so far are from this area in here, and this is where we'll go Saturday. So likely some open areas under those big trees, but a lot of big trees. And we're seeing this mountain alder stream complex. So basically Neil Creek is starting here. It's starting way up here too, and draining down this way. But you can see some of these same openings are still visible on more recent aerial photos. Oops, wrong way. There's that photo again, just also showing, this is a 960 acre parcel, Mount Ashland Demonstration Forest. This is another few hundred acres that 240, I suppose, that we had intended to transfer to the Forest Service because it's completely surrounded by Forest Service. Most of the Neil Creek sub-basin is Forest Service ownership. That's not looking too likely in the short term. So we may, we're thinking about restoration on this parcel as well, but mostly we're looking at this one. And we're going to fast forward quite a bit in time to 2005. We have acquired some digital images from the University of Oregon. They have this great digital library of historic aerial photos, but I haven't had a chance to geo-rectify those yet. We will be able to get some time between 1939 and 2005. But as you can see in this 2005 photo, there was a pretty big logging event, including some clear cuts just before this photo was taken. This is still that mountain alder riparian, like spring-fed stream complex that goes down into Neil Creek. Fast forward 15, 20 years, and there's a lot of young tree growth. You can see this, we'll be parking in here. We call this the headquarters area, but this is that ridge we've been looking at, and a lot of the photos are coming from in here, as well as some historical data I'll show you in a minute. This is just another recent photo. It gives you a good feel for the stream channel location. So this is opportunities and challenges related to management. As I mentioned, we did get our first little bit of funding for some management this past. We learned that we were going to receive it this past spring, and we thought, okay, let's consider fire as our first management tool on a 55-acre parcel, or a 55-acre unit in this area we've been looking at tonight. And as part of that, we've had Grayback out. They've got a lot of experience with Restore Fire. I've had great experiences working with them. And as part of the fire line prep, they had to cut a bunch of snags. And I knew that was part of it. I understand the safety piece of that. I didn't expect as many snags to come down as were cut. And so that's a really interesting piece of implementation, especially if you're implementing on a property where you live, or that you spend a lot of time with, and you actually sort of care about the detail. It could be worth, in some cases, talking with the practitioners and redrawing the fire line around a big snag, for instance, to be able to keep that on the landscape. And I mention that specifically because this property has been logged many times since the 1950s, and during logging, snags often have to be felt for safety purposes, and I completely understand that. And I'm not ever going to tell a logger or a fire practitioner to keep a snag standing that they genuinely feel is a safety hazard for themselves and their crew. But I might work with them to, like I mentioned, redraw the boundary lines if we know we only have a few 40-inch snags on the property and we want to keep those standing. So this is one of the snags that was felled, not super big. And mostly I was excited when I saw this because it yielded some interesting information. I'm just showing this one to show that it still has some fine branches, but no needles. I think it probably died within the last 10 years, maybe more recently. And so it turns out that with a photograph that you then zoom in on your computer screen, you can actually count these rings pretty well. And this tree had that, if it died within the last 10 years or so, this period right here was that initial logging. The initial logging on this property was post-World War II, like 1950s, 1960s era. Pretty common on private forest land in southwestern Oregon. The vast majority I've ever visited had initial thin from above high-grade logging starting in the 50s and 60s. So we're seeing that right here. We're seeing probably this initial logging. We're seeing very tight growth here. This initial logging, this in the 50s, a release from logging. This is about 60 years right here. And often with those initial logging periods, they were burning slash. So it looks like not only a growth release, but a little bit of char, maybe a fire disturbance there. Another one out here about 10 years later, probably also a slash burning related to the logging. And what's interesting is there are 130 years here, 130 rings. So this tree was growing in pretty dense canopy conditions for most of its 130 years prior to that logging release. And it looks like there are a couple fire events locked up in here. So I'm going to go back and get a cross section a little lower on the tree. And we should be able to cross date this and get some 1800s era fire scars out of this one, which will be pretty interesting. Just want to show the aerial photo again. So that's going to be right around in here somewhere, where that dug for stump was. Another bit of historical data. I call this forest sleuthing. It's my favorite thing to do when I'm out in the woods, just look at these stumps. There are a bunch of old cedars that were cut up on that same vicinity that we call the dry meadow. This one had about 320 rings. So that's how old it dates back to the 1600s probably. This is a fire event in here. You can tell by the way that the tree is growing around a wound. The fire end's down here and the tree is growing back over it. Some of you have probably noticed cat face fire scars on trees, and you can kind of see the tree every year is growing in and trying to cover that wound. There's another one out here. Here's the char and it's the tree, slowly growing around this wound. These were about 100 years apart, and this was about 120 years before the tree was cut. So we're getting, having fire events back we're actually having quite a long time between fire events, but we could have missed some low severity fire events on this particular tree. So pretty interesting to have that record out there. Long-lived trees and pretty slow growing, actually. Another image just to show you that Neal Creek subbasin. I just think it's interesting to see, here's Ashland Creek, here's this ridge, Bull Gap, if you're familiar with the area. We got the East Fork and the West Fork of Ashland Creek. And then this little Neal Creek drainage is pretty, it's not used much by people. There's some residences really down low. And if you think about this valley being inhabited for thousands of years and people lighting fires for various reasons, the fires had to travel through a kind of a complex dissected topography with a lot of water to travel up here. So you could imagine that during really dry periods, fire might be more likely to travel greater distances. But, during sort of wetter years, you could imagine fires lit closer to the valley, petering out before they ever even get up here. So there's a lot of sort of topographic variation, a lot of topographic roughness and patchiness that can both convey fire, but can also restrict fire. feel like I'm talking a lot here, but I'm going to give us just a little bit of just share a little bit of information from a regional fire history study. There have been a lot of fire history studies in Northern California and Southwestern Oregon. Carl Skinner is a fire historian who's done a lot of them. This one is from the Northern Klamath Mountains. He also worked up in the Rogue Valley. He worked with Carrie Metlin, and they sampled some fire scars a little bit lower elevation than the demonstration forest in the Ashland watershed and some other places around the Rogue Basin and in the Applegate. And this one in the Northern Klamath Mountains, it's an elevation and a forest type that seems similar to the Mount Ashland Demonstration Forest. And what I think is pretty interesting about this is that it's, as we know, a fire adapted ecosystem. There's fairly frequent fire. It's a Mediterranean climate. And there's also a lot of variation in the fire return interval. So they had a pretty big study site, something like it's close to 6 square miles. It was spanning a ridge. So they were looking at aspect and stand age, all sorts of different variables on fire frequency. And they found overall for the whole study site, around 15-year average fires returning to that landscape somewhere in that landscape every 15 years. There's a lot of variation. There's a big range around that mean. You could have a couple fires within a decade, and then you could skip 100 years. Now, with the mean and the median, that would be pretty long to skip a whole 100-year fire interval, but it happened. And that's the kind of variation that I think we're seeing on some of the tree samples up at the Mount Ashland Forest. They did find that south and west aspects had more frequent fire than north and east aspects. It was about a 350-year period of record. 85% of the fires were in the dormant season, so that's late summer and fall. Almost 12% in the late wood and 3.2% the early wood. So I couldn't resist throwing in this little picture. I want to show you what early wood and late wood is. So if you happen to geek out and read fire history studies like I do, you'll know what early wood and late wood means. And what it means is, if you imagine tree growth every year, grows out, it puts on wood cells going out and up. So it's kind of like a cone. And this little graphic up in the corner, this dark line is the ring boundary. And what that means is that's the point at which that tree stopped growing for the year. So if we're at Ponderosa Pine in your neighborhood, it could stop growing in August if it's a bad drought year. It could say, well, I'm done, it's hot, it's dry. If I keep going, I'm going to die. So it shuts down its growth. It could, if it's a nice year, plenty of water, not too hot, it could keep going into September. Some conifers will even do what's called put on a false ring. They'll even keep going, say, into October if it's really mild. But the early wood basically is from that dormancy. It comes out of winter. It's been dormant. It puts on really big, thin-walled cells, really fat cells of wood. First thing in the spring, when it's warm enough to start photosynthesizing and moving its fluids around, then it's putting on big growth. As it gets hotter and drier, those cell walls get thicker, the wood cells get smaller, and you start forming late wood. And that can go on for quite a while. So in this area, the late wood could start forming in July if it's a hot, dry year. It's probably likely starting in July around here. It could keep going, like I mentioned, if it's a mild year, it could keep putting on late wood into August, into September, even possibly October. And then at some point, it's just going to either be too hot, dry, or too cold, and it's going to stop. And so basically, your early wood fires are going to be spring and possibly into early summer, April, May, June. Your late wood fires are going to be summertime, July, maybe August, and your dormant season are going to be after that, or at the ring boundary, so fall, late summer, fall. So there's your wood cell pick diagram. It is a little fuzzy. There have been various, you can do a little study, you can core trees and look at the cells. You could stick a nail in them to try to determine when those changes are. But dormancies in late summer, we're probably in dry years starting that in August, September, October, somewhere in there. Okay, enough about that. One other thing I thought was interesting was that Skinner and Taylor in this study, they concluded that they didn't think fire suppression was really effective in the rugged Klamath Mountains until after World War II. So maybe around 46 or so. Whereas in this other paper we'll look at in a few minutes, this Malcolm North paper in the Sierra Nevadas, they found that actually fire suppression was more effective earlier, closer to the time when that became the official forest policy in the U.S., more like around 1905. And it kind of makes sense. The Sierra Nevadas were much more populated, the Stanislaus National Forest and redwood. So one more thing before we move on. This is kind of interesting. They break the average fire return interval down to the pre-settlement time, so before 1850. This settlement time, I've seen this listed in other fire history studies as like a conflict and settlement period, 1850 to 1904. That's sometimes marked by actually an increase in fires because fire was used in conflict and in land clearing by Euro-Americans. And then the suppression period, of course, the fire return interval tends to be quite lengthened in that period. Back to our current composition. So we have maybe a little window into the forest history, just fire history. So what are we going to do with this current young forest with so many young white fir stems and fewer big trees of more fire and drought resistant species? We're going to follow along this conceptual model that is going to be very familiar to you all. Just this same story we've been talking about of big trees historically maintained by fire, whether it's frequent or periodic, episodic, low to moderate intensity. Things grow in absence of disturbance. We have this logging period where the biggest and best and most fire resistant were removed. Following that, we have this massive growth of young trees that with, the synergistic effect of excluding fire, then you have this sort of almost a monoculture. You don't have a rich understory of native shrubs and forbs, and you get these sort of dense dog hair type conditions. And so you can do a release treatment. I do want to say that, competition is not the only model happening in forests. We know there's mutualism. We know there's symbiosis. We know that trees are sharing resources via roots and fungi underground. So while this, competition model is really important and helpful, it's not the only process going on between trees and between trees and shrubs. So we've got this sort of along the lines of that same model, just a conceptual diagram showing, increased density on north slopes, decreased density on south slopes, and this sort of heterogeneity, patchiness within a forested landscape that one would expect as a target to work toward. All right, we're really getting into the weeds now. Malcolm North, I think he was a student of Jerry Franklin's. He's down at UC Davis. When I came across this study, I was really happy to see this in print, this idea of thinning trees for forest resilience. Not just doing fuels reduction to impart resistance to fire on, say, a large tree or a home. Yes, of course, around a home, we're going to do fuels reduction. We want that home to be resistant to fire. We don't want it to burn. On a small scale, we might want to do fuels reduction because we want key trees to be resistant to fire or key parts of the landscape to be resistant to fire. But when we're going to talk more broadly about Western U.S. forests, we want to talk about resilience to disturbance. We can't resist fire. It's not possible. It's part of the landscape. A lot of these plants are adapted to it and need it, actually. So how do we work within this framework where we can't resist fire? We need to make forests more resilient to fire. And there's often actually a direct conflict between fuel reduction and wildlife habitat when fuel reduction calls for removing the shrub layer and removing all the downwood and snags, which we know are critical for wildlife. So I was happy to see this. And this is really a big part of the underpinning of our sort of restoration framework we're using on the property, is this concept that when you thin the trees and reduce the competition, the density of the trees, you're potentially imparting more vigor to the trees. They're going to be then more resilient to disturbances like fire, insects, drought. And so this violin plot, as it's called, down here is in 3 categories. They sampled, the authors of this study sampled a pine mixed conifer forest, xeric mixed conifer forest, and mesic mixed conifer forest. This is in the west slope of the Sierra Nevadas in the Stanislaus, and the other big forest to the south that has redwoods. And they looked at historic forest stand data. They did some reconstructions, and let me explain what this is. So they basically use this kind of standard forestry metric, the stand density index, as a proxy for, or it's known to sort of indicate competition. It's a measurement of competition. And then from there, the corollary being vigor. So if you have reduced, oh, I'm so sorry. If you have reduced competition, you can have more vigor. And so the stand density index is a combination of the size and number of trees. So basically, you have a max stand density index that's up here 100%. And then you have your current stand composition, wherever you're at is a percentage of this max. Max is like nothing else can grow there. It's way too dense. This 25%, that's supposed to be the onset of competition. So basically under here, there's very little competition. Part of their thinking with this, looking at this competition model, is thinking that fire acts like an herbivore. Over time, if you've got these fire adapted forests that are maintained by fire is going to come through and pick off stems. So it's going to keep this competition relatively low. And what we're seeing here, there's their 1911 data set, the pre-fire exclusion period. They are seeing that a lot of trees in all 3 of these habitat types having very little competition. And they're also seeing trees in this 25 to 35% of the maximum stand density index is supposed to be this 35, the low end of what they're calling full occupancy. These are forestry terms. The full occupancy being like if you plant all the trees in the square, the most you can plant and still have them have enough resources to grow at a reasonable rate. And then we're getting more and more competition. 60% is supposed to be the zone of imminent mortality. Sounds ominous, right? So trees are really competing for resources. They're really not growing very well from here to here. On a patchy scale, we want some of that. We need snag patches where we wouldn't have woodpeckers without the zone of imminent mortality and trees like duking it out for resources and dying. But we don't want all the trees up here. So basically, the Mount Ashland Demonstration Forest, the habitat types are more similar to this xeric or mesic mixed conifer categories. And historically, we're having a lot of, we'll look again at this, but we're having a lot of most of the forest sitting here in this, like they're competing somewhat for resources, but they're not all down here in the highly dense category. So to look at some stand delineations from the property, these were this unit number 45 here in the center is a lot of the photos I've been showing you today are from this area. These units or stands were delineated by, I think, Plum Creek or some timber company that previously owned the property. We kept them because we had some historic data and have updated that data set. But the initial area we're considering burning is this ridge. Basically, it's got this west-facing slope. In the 1939 aerial photo, you can see a bit more openness in here. It's got a road bounding a good bit of it, so not requiring a lot of fire line construction, a little bit of fire line construction needing to be constructed, and this sort of more gentle topography. So what are we going to do with this unit? Prescribed fire is one of the treatments we're looking at. We're also looking at small diameter thinning and, medium-sized, commercial-sized tree thinning. So that unit 45, and I'm winding down. If this is feeling long, it is, but it's coming to an end soonish. This is unit 45. It's about 38 acres. These numbers, these forest data are based on trees greater than 8 inches in diameter breast height. So they're quite a large number of stems, smaller than 8 inches as well. But the stand density index, if we look at the percentage of the max for this property, for that unit, subunit stand 45, it's at about 52%. So it's sitting right in here. So there's, following this model, this school of thought, there's a lot of competition happening. And if we want the trees to be vigorous, to be able to fend off beetle attacks during drought years and have enough space to survive fire, potentially during wildfire season, then we're going to want to do some thinning. We're also seeing this species distribution: Doug fir, white fir, incense cedar, ponderosa pine, bigleaf maple, golden chinkapin. We're seeing a lot of white fir and incense cedar, and not a lot of these more drought tolerant species like the pine, like the Doug fir. So our restoration options, our management options we're thinking about include small diameter thinning, the trees under 8 inches that actually aren't reflected in these numbers we're looking at. But I showed you a slide of sort of dense young trees, and we'll see those Saturday. So, the way to do that is to potentially come up with a species preference and use a spacing. Now, we don't want a grid like a planted plantation, but there's enough variation in the sand and natural features that aren't going to be thin to help cultivate patchiness. So you can use a spacing like 20 feet or 25 feet just to make a somewhat digestible, simple prescription, for the implementers, and you can still get some a lot of heterogeneity, structural and species heterogeneity out of the treatment. And so if folks are interested in that, we can certainly go into more detail about how to come up with a really simple prescription. But another treatment we're thinking about is commercial thinning. I showed on that DBH distribution, we don't have a lot of large trees, so we're not going to cut the large trees. The commercial thin would be places that are easy to access without causing a lot of erosion. It would be trees in the 8 to 20 inch category. A lot of logging in our region is break-even logging. Maybe it would be break-even logging, or maybe we could get a little bit of money to put back into the property, additional treatments that aren't going to pay for themselves, whether that's the burning or culvert replacements, that sort of thing. Prescribed fire. Our big question is, can we just use this as a treatment by itself? Would it be effective within the parameters we have to operate in for safety? Could we get a fire hot enough to kill enough small diameter conifers to achieve the kind of thinning we want to achieve without running a chainsaw on every acre? can we also do that without sacrificing all our large down wood and snags? These are some of the questions we're really looking at with prescribed fire. Also interested in understory plant species effects and some other wildlife related questions, one of which is around pollinators. BMP's best management practices. We're still working on identifying best management practices up here. We learned that the property is in the general vicinity where Franklin's bumblebees were last seen, and similar bumblebee to the Franklin, similar life history is the western bumblebee, which could be listed as a threatened or endangered species in the future. Very similar life history to the Franklins. And we learned that they actually overwinter in the leaf litter, forest leaf litter adjacent to meadows or other areas where they have a lot of floral resources during the growing season. And so a best management practice might be to not burn the whole meadow or the whole forest edge all in one event, or to make sure it's a mosaic burn with significant unburned patches, because their life history involves basically all the individuals of the colony dying except for the mated queen, the queen carrying the eggs for the next generation. She's the only one that then crawls under some leaf litter adjacent to this meadow that we want to burn to wait out the winter. So interesting. There's a lot of nuance, a lot of detail. It's really fun to learn about, and it's ongoing. If anybody says they have all the answers, they're wrong. We're all just learning. I mean, I think the people who evolved here for millennia probably have all the answers. But with reductionist science, it takes a long time. And so we're trying to bring in all the natural resource leaders we can and advisors. And we're also sharing the property with youth, with high school students, upper division high school students, with Southern Oregon University students, just hoping to get folks out on the ground, having conversations about management, learning, doing the monitoring, and implementing what we think is good, sound, climate resilient management practices. And so I think that's my long-winded talk here.
That's been
So I'd
great.
love to hear questions. Yeah.
If anybody has a question, you're welcome to vocalize it or put it in the chat. Lyndia, you mentioned a couple times the road network up there and how extensive, and in those aerial photos, especially that 2005, it was like, woo, where isn't there a road, right?
Yeah.
And it's, decomposed granite, substrate or soil type is, are you guys doing anything to sort of decommission roads or better manage the road network that's up there?
Yeah. We are working on our sort of road inventory and decommission plan, basically looking at in the short term, starting management where we can. We have this one mainline road that's pretty good. That's really been our focus so far, is making sure the culverts are working properly and that the mainline road isn't dumping sediment. A lot of those smaller roads are pretty grown in, but we do have a network of prioritized sort of culverts to look at on the whole system. So it's basically a question of, what can we decommission altogether? What do we need to improve first so that we can do some management that we think will set up the forest, set up the structure in a better and a more resilient condition, and then decommission the road? So maybe we feel like an area really needs thinning and all we have to do is repair a few small sections. Then we can get in there, do some thinning, do a burn, then maybe we can decommission, pull out the culverts. We have had a tour of the hydrologist and fish biologist trying to think, should we try to put in a bridge here? instead of a culvert, or can we just decommission this altogether? So those are sort of ongoing conversations. We haven't figured it out, but that's definitely on the radar. Like you said, it's decomposed granite, so really erosive soils, and that road network is definitely extensive.
I mean, you mentioned there's some tailed frogs up there in, where they do occur, and like you said, they're rare, tends to be above fish passage. And so,
Yeah.
you think about like, well, how important if there aren't fish in that part of the system, is maintaining fish passage at those culverts as important as sediment passage, and, just kind of striking that balance. But there could be some, benefits to aquatic organisms, obviously, if they're moving up and down that corridor. And it's also really cool to hear about the mountain beaver. And it feels like sometimes those areas, my experience as meadows, seem dry, but there's actually a ton of water moving down through the soil underneath through mountain beaver tunnels.
Yeah.
Kind of like we see up in some of the meadows below Mount Ashland.
Yeah, it's been a big surprise to me actually. At this property, there will be big leaf maple and willow growing in a completely upland position, like on an upland slope. And there's clearly a lot of water under the ground there. Um,
Lyndia, we got a couple questions here. So Kathy Kellerman's wondering what the acreage was. I think you mentioned 1,100 or 1,200 acres.
yeah, well, let me see if I could easily go to a picture without making you seasick. It's 960 acres is that contiguous section or group of sort of squares. And then there's that the property as a whole is something like 1,160. So I guess it's another 240. That is that what a quarter section is? Uh, that other parcel that's disjunct. So together, the whole property is 1,100 acres, but it's the 960 that we've been mostly looking
Tom says, great, incredible presentation, very educational and not overwhelming. Um,
at.
uh,
Thanks, Tom.
David says, I'm interested in restoration of forests, which includes some and mostly non-commercial species, sugar pine, golden chinkapin, Pacific yew, but have had some difficulty obtaining starts in quantity at reasonable price for those species. Any suggestions on good sources? He's saying he's worked with Sugar Pine Foundation for Lambertinas, but currently have no good sources for other species. And that kind of touches on something which I was interested too, and maybe you can mention if you guys are thinking about doing some planting up there to augment your species diversity.
Yeah, I would be more than happy to do a little research on that and get back to you, David. I know that my coworker Jack has worked on procuring trees for our Van Eck property up in the Coast Range, and also for a property in Northern California, McLeod Soda Springs vicinity. So he knows some of the Northern California, Southern Oregon producers. I think sugar pine, we should be able to get some sugar pine, but I'm really glad to hear you say yew, because that is one tree that's missing up here that I'm sure was there historically. I'm sure there were some tremendous yews. There are a few small ones that I've seen. Chinkapin, I don't know. You could get some seed from our chinkapin bushes. Um, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I have to think that getting it directly from seed for the chinkapin and the yew, but I'll have to ask around because I don't actually know.
And did you say whether you guys are thinking about planting more sugar pine up in that forest?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. The order of sort of our treatments got a little shuffled when we got this restoration money, and we thought, oh hey, let's burn first and see what happens. Um, and the idea of post burn or post thinning would be to put in some sugar pine. We've had some different advisory groups up there. We had some folks up talking about the burn. We had Chris Adlam, who you're going to hear from soon. We had Chaya Werner, who's a plant ecologist at SOU, and Jamie Stevens from KBO. And who am I forgetting? But at any rate, we were looking at talking about the burn and talking about the idea of bringing up some black oak acorns and some white oak acorns and just dumping them in a pile and seeing if the bears and birds disperse them into appropriate locations. So it's a little bit high elevation for both of those species. Maybe not quite right for white oak. There are a few black oaks on the property, but I have heard that it can be really hard to establish oaks, black and white oaks from plantings, that it's just as well to try to establish them from acorns if you've got time.
Perhaps they'll do better there with a changing climate too. You said that there are a few there that are representative, and maybe their niche is growing, and especially if you're able to bring back some fire in that area too.
Well, that's definitely something to think about. Looking at these climate models and projections for the next 50 to 100 years. I mean, thinking about sort of warming and sort of elevational gradients moving up and north, species moving upward and northward in elevation. Yeah, I think it does make sense to see if the oaks want to march up the hill there.
David had also asked if you know of any good sources of grant funding for restoration on private lands. I suspect it sounds like you guys are working with a OWEB grant for the restoration right now. What else are you aware of that's out there?
That's a great question. I think the grant world is kind of tough. There's a lot of competition. I've applied for a lot of smaller grants, and those are maybe mostly for nonprofits, and there's a lot of competition. I'll have to think on that for small woodland owners. There's the Understory Initiative is a great nonprofit. And their partner organization, the Rogue Native Plant Partnership, that are trying to make native seed available for private land restoration. They might know something about, they might sometimes have access to grant funding. In fact, I know that they do. I know that I'm remembering one of the Southern Oregon Land Conservancy properties I worked on, the Understory Initiative actually had some grant funds to bring in some seed and to do some reseeding post-logging of some native understory species.
Yeah, it seems like the forest restoration thinning grants and things like that that are fuels focused from ODF and other agencies, they tend to go with focal areas, in the WUI kind of edge of towns where the highest sort of priority is right now. So if you're lucky enough to fall in one of those areas and you want the work and the grants, then it's available. But if you're not, then it can be harder to get to and more competitive at this point. Might have to do more cost share. I know NRCS has also put money in the game, but I'm not sure what they're doing right now with the current state of things in the federal government.
Yeah, before the latest federal government changes, I think I had heard they were maybe shifting away from the focal area to more EQIP grants, which can be distributed more broadly spatially. They do have cost share requirements, but yeah, I mean, who knows right now with the federal agencies? I don't. But those NRCS has been a good source of some
David
restoration funds.
made a couple other comments about survival and having low success, less than 20% with sugar pine, and improving success with oaks by kind of moving into some of the cooler habitats. Have you guys done any, I guess, have you had much, you observed some sugar pine up there. Have you had any, maybe outside of this property experience that you're working on, have you had any experience with sort of trying to replant sugar pine or success for survival there?
I mean, just in general, getting seedlings to even with plants that are sown sort of naturally, whether you're planting the sugar pine or just talking about even oaks that sprout. I mean, getting trees from that seedling stage to recruiting to like a sapling and an adult tree, that's pretty challenging, and it's a small percentage that survive. And so much of it has to do with precipitation, before and during and after planting. I don't have personally specific experience with sugar pine. that's something Marty Main would probably have a lot to say about. But I know that it can be really tough to get those restoration plantings, through their first few years and even beyond. Can really help a lot if it's during favorable weather years.
You mentioned that this property had maybe long intervals between fires at times in history, and that you want to, you're kind of thinking maybe retaining more downed wood on the ground, thinking that it's probably less likely to pose a hazard as a fire fuel, and has, a lot of benefits in terms of soil building and protection against erosion and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about that? You mentioned the fungal interaction. We
Yeah.
had a speaker last night, Maya Ellison, talking about, a lot of her work was focused on pressing wood into the ground and having fungi dissolve and decompose it. But she talked about the differences between wet and dry, and how in our area, wood could lay on the ground in a dry forest for decades or longer, and that in wetter forests the fungi could do more work. So given that you've got a higher elevation site, maybe a little cooler, wetter, what do you think the potential is for fungi to do some of that work there compared to some of the, more standard forests we see in Southwest Oregon?
Yeah, I do think this site it's more music. It holds water longer. That big wood is going to hold water longer, and then have more time to have the fungi working on it each season than someplace, more exposed, lower elevation that's going to dry out, more quickly. Um, we do logging in general tends to always sort of reduce the amount of snags and large down wood, whether you're at low dry or high wet north facing elevation. Um, that's just been a big disturbance the last 70 years. Um, and there's this concept that, oh, fire, burned every 5 years, so that down wood would have burned up. Well, okay, the mean or the median might be a 5-year return interval, but there's a lot of noise around that mean or median, and fire moves in a really patchy configuration. So even in our driest landscapes, patches of shrubs, patches of downwood would escape fire for, even decades at a time. And those large down logs that hold the moisture late into the season are disproportionately important for, just for animals, like the insects at the base of the animal food chain on up, the herps, the salamanders and lizards and that sort of thing, and the small mammals. And so, yeah, especially up at this like wet higher elevation, I'm not worried about large downwood and snags as fire hazard. I'm not really worried about them down lower, dry or hotter as snag, like because they retain the moisture so much longer. It's one thing if they're up against a home, but um, they,
Yeah.
yeah,
Maya had made the point last night about, the importance of pressing the wood into the ground and that contact, and how that really supported the decomposition. It strikes me that in a snow zone like this, you've got that extra weight of the snow, kind of like you mentioned with the snow limiting the alders growth form, like just that weight
yeah,
pressing the wood down into the ground through the winter probably also helps with that process.
yeah, definitely. And last year it was under snow for what? November, December, January, February, March, April, 6 months. Half the year it was under snow. That was a good winter. So, yeah, and that moisture, the big stuff holds that moisture, and it's like you said, a lot of good soil contact pretty long into the summer.
Well, we're getting running close on time here, but there's one last question about regarding climate resilience. Any change to planting strategies to gear for the future rather than for the present? I think that's just that, question again, are you hedging your bet with trying to shift that species composition up there at all?
I mean, really the biggest thing we've talked about is dumping a big pile of black oak acorns up there, like I said, to see if the wildlife could disperse them, thinking that, yeah, as the climate warms, maybe that species is going to need to move up in elevation. The other thing would be, I guess, since the same slide is up here, reducing sort of the white fir density to get a little more a little more evenness sort of across these species distributions, so that some of the species like the cedar, like the Doug fir, they have a pretty big range and they are drought tolerant. So just working with the species that are already there and native to that site that have that sort of drought tolerance. And then trying to bring back the sugar pine. They may not be as drought tolerant, but they're still, that'd be well within the heart of their range at 5,000 to 6,000 feet. So, but yeah, not really so much with the assisted migration concept as accentuating the site adaptive native drought tolerant species.
In our last couple minutes, do you want to mention anything about the field trip for Saturday? I just posted the directions in the chat just in case anybody was wondering. You will get an email, or you did get an email from our registration system with the directions if you're registered for that field trip. But here's just, I don't know, Lindy, here's your opportunity to say anything about Saturday if you'd like.
Let's see if you have any last minute questions about how to get there. I don't know if my contact info is in your instructions, but feel free to get in touch. We will be able to take a look at a lot of what we saw in the presentation today. We can look at the burn unit area, some different habitat types. We'll see that high elevation mountain alder, riparian, this more open meadow, and a little bit of age diversity in the forest. And we'll just basically walk and talk and talk a little bit about treatment options and see what we see.
That sounds great. Looking forward to being up there. And for others, if you have my contact, and through our system, you can always email me if you have any questions. But you should have the information to meet us there on Saturday, and we'll go from there and explore the property a little bit.
Yeah, we always have great conversations in the field. That's the best part.
Absolutely. And aren't we blessed to have so many great field sites to go to here? This looks like a
Indeed.
really neat project, Lyndia. I'm super excited what Pacific Forest Trust is doing with and for this property, being so close to the Ashland watershed. And some of my early work with fishers led me into there, and I had the same observation as you, which is not many people visit the Neal Creek watershed, and so it makes an incredible asset for wildlife to move up and down in elevation from the valley all the way up to the crest, and that includes Pacific fishers and elk and pretty much everything else in our region. So thanks for stewarding this lovely property.
Thanks, Eugene. Thanks for sharing your info about fishers, and even telling us about the cutthroat trout you found in that upper Neal Creek some years back.
Looking forward to seeing you on Saturday, Lyndia, and thanks again for the presentation. Thank you all for joining us this evening. And feel free to reach out to me if you've got more ideas for presentations, or if you want to get in touch with Lyndia, I can connect you.
Thanks, everybody.